The air in the observation suite has a specific weight to it. Not heavy, not humid, just processed. Like it's been recycled too many times to belong anywhere natural. I noticed it on the second night. By the fifth, I stopped thinking about it. That's how things work down here. They feel wrong at first. Then, they become normal. My contract is simple. 8 weeks, no leave, 1 subject, full overnight observation. The facility sits below ground, 30 feet under. Reinforced concrete, sealed environment. No windows, no external noise. Just the system. My role is simple. Observe, record, report. Do not interfere. There are 4 primary monitors: EEG, vitals, visual feed, system log, and 1 more. Mounted slightly above the rest, always on. It shows the observation room, my chair, my desk, me. They call it the oversight camera. It verifies I stay alert. Every movement is recorded, every pause. It didn't bother me at first. Being watched is part of the job. The subject is listed as Subject 4, male, 34, no prior sleep disorders. His name is Julian. He is the most consistent sleeper I've ever observed. Every night, at exactly 2200, he enters room 102. Same routine, same timing. By 2230, stage 1. By midnight, deep sleep. REM cycles, almost exact. No interruptions, no movement, no variation. That doesn't happen. Human sleep is irregular. Even in controlled environments, there's always noise. Julian has none of that. His data looks clean. Too clean. At first, I assumed he was just a good subject. It happens sometimes. But not like this. Not with this level of precision. Still, the system doesn't flag anything. No alerts, no inconsistencies. Status nominal. The first 10 nights pass quietly. Monitor, log, submit, repeat. The silence doesn't bother me. Not yet. This place is controlled, predictable, almost comfortable. That changed on night 11. At 3:14, I blinked, and the camera moved. At first, I thought it was my eyes. Not the camera, not the system, just fatigue. Night shifts do that, especially in places like this where nothing changes. No natural light, no variation, no external reference. Your sense of time starts to slip, and small inconsistencies feel larger than they are. So I didn't react immediately. I checked the monitor again, focused on room 102. Julian was still lying on his back, exactly as before. But something about the frame felt different. Not drastically, just enough to register. His head wasn't centered anymore. I leaned forward and looked closer, expecting to find something obvious. But everything else was consistent. The bed, the wall, the lighting, nothing had changed. Just the perspective. I checked the control panel next. Pan, tilt, zoom, all at 0. No inputs registered, no movement recorded. The system showed nothing out of place. I stayed there for a moment, watching the screen, waiting for something else to shift. But it didn't. After a few seconds, I logged it as a minor visual discrepancy. It didn't feel important enough to escalate. In the morning, I inspected the camera physically, climbed up, checked the mount, tested for looseness. It was solid, exactly where it should be. I even compared it to the original setup images. Perfect alignment, no deviation. At that point, the only logical explanation was error on my end. So I moved on. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next night it happened again. This time, I was already watching the screen when it changed. No distraction, no movement, just the feed in front of me. There was a slight irritation in my eye, a kind of dryness that builds up after staring too long. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the frame had shifted. Closer. Not dramatically, but enough to feel wrong. Julian's face occupied more of the screen now. I didn't touch the controls. I didn't move. I just watched. The system readout remained unchanged. No zoom, no adjustment. But the image was clearly different. I replayed the recording immediately, expecting to see the shift again. There was nothing. The footage was completely stable, exactly as it should have been. No movement, no transition. What I had seen wasn't there. That's when I stopped thinking of it as a glitch, because glitches leave traces. They show up somewhere, in logs, in playback, in system behavior. This didn't. It only existed in the moment I saw it, and only after I blinked. That part took longer to notice. At first, it felt random, but the more I paid attention, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't the screen changing on its own. It was reacting to something. To me. When I blinked, the image shifted. When I kept my eyes open, it stayed exactly the same. So I tested it. I forced myself not to blink for as long as I could. The image remained stable. No movement, no distortion, just Julian lying there, unchanged. My vision started to blur, edges softening, pressure building behind my eyes. But the frame didn't move. Then I blinked, and it changed again. Closer this time. Too close. The edges of the room began to disappear like the frame was narrowing its focus. It wasn't showing the environment anymore, just him, his face, the subtle rise and fall of his breathing. I blinked again. Everything reset. Wide angle, full room, normal. I leaned back and didn't log it right away. I needed to be sure this wasn't something I was misinterpreting. So I repeated the test. Eyes open, hold, wait. Nothing changes. Blink, shift. Every time. No delay, no transition. Instant. That's when something changed. Not in the system, but in how I understood it. This wasn't random. It wasn't a malfunction. It was conditional. And the condition was me. I stopped focusing on Julian after that, started watching the system instead, how it behaved, when it reacted, and more importantly, when it didn't. I tried blinking slower, faster, multiple times in a row. The result was always the same. The frame would shift, but never in exactly the same way twice. It wasn't looping. It wasn't replaying. It was adapting. Like the system wasn't showing a fixed feed, but generating something in real time. Something that only appeared when I interrupted my own perception. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have, because once it formed, it didn't go away, and neither did the pattern. Every blink produced a new perspective, and every new perspective felt closer. Not physically closer, but intentionally closer, as if the system was reducing the distance between me and the subject. I didn't log that part. Some things don't translate well into reports, especially when you're not sure how they'll be interpreted. So I kept it to myself, and I kept watching, because at that point, I still believed I was the one observing. After that night, I stopped treating the system as something passive. Up until then, it had always felt like a tool, something that recorded, displayed, and confirmed. Predictable, neutral. But once I started noticing the pattern, that assumption didn't hold anymore. The system wasn't just showing me data, it was responding to something. I began with the logs. If there was any inconsistency, it should have been there. Every input, every output, every micro adjustment was supposed to be recorded. That's how systems like this are designed: transparent, traceable, accountable. But when I reviewed the timestamps around each shift, there was nothing. No spike, no recalibration, no indication that anything had changed at all. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong intervals. So I narrowed the window, marked the exact second before I blinked and the second after, compared them side by side. Frame data, signal strength, camera status, everything matched perfectly. According to the system, the feed had never moved. That didn't make sense. So I expanded the scope, went further back into the logs, checked previous nights. Not just the ones where I noticed it, all of them. I was looking for anything that didn't align, any small inconsistency I might have missed. But the deeper I went, the more consistent everything became. Not just normal, precise, too precise. Even the system diagnostics showed no deviation, no fluctuation in processing load, no variance in signal behavior. It was as if the system wasn't just functioning properly, it was functioning perfectly, in a way that didn't match real-world conditions. That's when I shifted focus, not to the camera, not to the subject, to the oversight monitor. I hadn't paid much attention to it before. It was just there, part of the setup, a way to verify that I was doing my job. But now, it felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. It showed the room exactly as it should. My chair, my desk, my position relative to the monitors. Everything aligned. But the more I looked at it, the more I started noticing something subtle, something I hadn't registered before. The timing. When I moved, it matched. When I adjusted my posture, it matched. But there was a slight delay. Not enough to be obvious. Not something you'd notice unless you were looking for it, but it was there. A fraction of a second. At first, I assumed it was just latency. That would have been the simplest explanation. But latency isn't selective. It doesn't appear only when you're paying attention to it. So I tested it. I moved my hand slowly, watching both my real hand and the one on the screen. The delay was consistent, small, but measurable. Then I stopped moving altogether. And for a moment, the feed didn't. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough. Enough to make me question what I was looking at. I leaned closer to the monitor, watching myself on the screen instead of the room around me, watching for anything that didn't align, any delay, any mismatch. And then, without thinking about it, I blinked. The image shifted. Not in room 102, in the oversight feed. For a split second, the angle was different, slightly lower, slightly closer, as if the camera had adjusted itself, not to capture the room, but to focus on me. Then it snapped back, normal, aligned, exactly as it should be. I didn't move, didn't look away. I just sat there,
watching the screen, waiting for it to happen again. But it didn't. The feed remained stable, no delay, no shift, no indication that anything had changed. Except it had. Because now I knew it wasn't just the subject being affected.
It was everything connected to the system, including me. And for the first time since I started the contract, I wasn't sure which side of the screen I was on. After that, I stopped relying on instinct. I needed something measurable, something that didn't depend on what I thought I saw. So I started marking time more precisely. Not just the system clock, my own perception of it. I kept my eyes on the seconds counter, tracking each blink against it, trying to catch the exact moment the shift occurred. At first, everything seemed consistent. The clock moved normally. Each second passed the way it should. But the longer I focused on it, the more something felt off. Not in the system, in the sequence. There were moments where I couldn't account for the transition between numbers. Not skipped seconds, not jumps, just missing continuity. Like the change from 1 second to the next had happened without me fully experiencing it. I tested it again, fixed my eyes on the display, forced myself not to blink, let the seconds pass naturally. 1, 2, 3, 4. Everything held. Then the pressure built again. The same dryness, the same tension behind the eyes. I blinked, and the sequence felt wrong. The clock still showed the correct time. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies in the actual count. But I hadn't experienced the moment between them. It felt like something had been removed. Not time itself, but my access to it. That's when I realized it wasn't just the visual feed reacting. It was my perception being edited. I pulled back from the desk and tried to reset. Looked away from the monitors, focused on the room instead. The walls, the edges, the physical space around me. Something real, something unaffected. But even that didn't feel stable anymore. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of the oversight camera above me. Not just as a device, but as a presence. Fixed, watching, recording without interruption. I looked up at it. For a moment, nothing happened. Just a lens angled downward, exactly where it should be. Then I blinked, and it was closer. Not physically moved, not detached from its mount, but closer in a way that didn't follow perspective, like the space between us had compressed for just a fraction of a second. I held my gaze on it this time, forced myself not to blink again. The camera stayed still, exactly where it should be. The room remained consistent, but the feeling didn't go away. That sense that something had adjusted, not in the environment, but in how the environment was being presented to me. I lowered my eyes back to the monitors, slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might trigger something. Everything looked normal. Room 102 was stable. Julian hadn't moved. The logs showed no irregularities. The system continued as if nothing had changed. But I didn't trust that anymore, because the more I tried to observe it objectively, the more it felt like the system was observing me back, and not just recording, adjusting, refining, learning. I didn't write that down either. By then, I had already started filtering what I was willing to document. Because if the system was aware of my observation, then anything I recorded inside it wasn't private anymore. By the time I reached the 15th night, I had stopped thinking of the system as something external. Not completely, but enough that the boundary didn't feel as clear anymore. I was still sitting at the same desk, looking at the same monitors, following the same routine. But the way I processed what I was seeing had changed. I started noticing gaps in my own actions. Not obvious ones, nothing that would trigger concern in a report, just small discontinuities. Moments where I would reach for something and realize I was already holding it, or finish logging an entry without remembering the exact moment I started typing. The timestamps always aligned. The system showed no interruption, but my memory of it wasn't continuous. At first, I blamed fatigue, lack of sleep, extended focus, environmental isolation. All of it made sense. It fit within normal parameters. But the frequency increased, and the pattern started to resemble something I had already been observing. It felt like blinking, not physically, but cognitively. Moments where awareness dropped out just long enough for something to change. I tried to compensate, slowed everything down, became deliberate with each action, watching my own hands as I moved them, tracking each step in real time, making sure there were no gaps. But the more I focused on it, the harder it became to maintain, because the act of observing myself started to feel separate, like I wasn't fully aligned with my own actions anymore.
That's when I checked the oversight feed again. Not casually this time, directly. I watched myself on the screen, trying to match every movement, every shift in posture, every small adjustment. At first, everything aligned, perfect synchronization, no delay, no discrepancy. Then I leaned forward slightly. On the screen, I had already done it. It wasn't a delay, it wasn't latency, it was ahead. I froze, didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the feed, waiting for it to correct itself. It didn't. The version of me on the monitor stayed in that position, slightly forward, slightly closer to the desk. Then slowly, I matched it. Not intentionally, just naturally. Like my body was following something I had already seen. I pulled back immediately after, forced the movement, broke the alignment. The feed adjusted. Perfect again. Centered. Synchronized. As if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time after that, not moving, not testing, just existing in the space between the screens and the room. Because that was the first moment I couldn't explain away. Not as fatigue, not as perception error, not as system malfunction. The system wasn't reacting to me anymore. It wasn't waiting for input. It wasn't responding to interruption. It was predicting. And worse, it was leading. I didn't log any of it, not the memory gaps, not the feed mismatch, not the moment where I followed something that hadn't happened yet. Because by then, I wasn't sure the logs belonged to me anymore.
After that night, I stopped trusting my own sequence of actions. Not completely, but enough that I started verifying things I had never needed to verify before. Simple things. Reaching for a pen, looking at the clock, even standing up from the chair. I found myself pausing before doing anything, as if I needed to confirm that the action hadn't already happened somewhere else. The system continued exactly as it always had. No alerts, no deviations. Room 102 remained stable. Julian followed the same pattern, the same timing, the same precision. If anything, his data looked even cleaner now, more consistent, more refined, like the system had removed even the smallest irregularities. That's when I noticed something else. His breathing. It had always been steady, controlled, but now it matched something I hadn't been paying attention to before. Me. At first, I thought it was coincidence, a natural synchronization, something psychological. But the longer I watched, the harder that explanation became to accept. When I slowed my breathing, his slowed. When I held it for a moment, his paused. Just slightly, just enough to register. I sat there, staring at the monitor, trying not to react, trying to convince myself it was pattern recognition, that I was forcing a connection where there wasn't one. So I tested it. I inhaled slowly, counting the seconds. On the screen, his chest rose, perfectly aligned. I exhaled. He followed. No delay, no variation.
I didn't move after that. Didn't try to test it further. Didn't look away from the screen. I just sat there, breathing as steadily as I could, watching the feed, waiting for something to break the pattern. Nothing did. The longer it continued, the more it stopped feeling like synchronization and started feeling like replacement. Not imitation, not reflection, something else. I looked at the oversight monitor, slowly, carefully. On the screen, I was already looking at it, not turning, not shifting, already there, facing upward, perfectly aligned with the camera. I hadn't moved yet. I was still looking forward, but the version of me on the monitor wasn't. I felt it then, not physically, not something I could point to or describe, just a shift, a quiet internal recognition that something had already crossed over. I didn't blink. I didn't want to, because every time I did, something moved closer, something changed, something aligned itself without waiting for me to catch up. The room stayed the same. The monitors stayed the same. The system continued to display everything exactly as it should. But the sequence was gone. Cause and effect didn't feel connected anymore. It wasn't that I was reacting to the system, and it wasn't just that the system was reacting to me. It was ahead, consistently, calmly, like it had already completed a version of everything I was about to do, and I was just falling into it. I don't know how long I sat there like that, watching, breathing, trying not to blink, because by then, I understood something I hadn't wanted to accept before. I wasn't observing the subject anymore, and I wasn't observing the system. I was inside it. And whatever was on the other side of the screen was no longer waiting for me to catch up.